Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Billy D's podcast. I'm absolutely thrilled that you are here. If you have never checked out our program before, we are essentially a commentary and an interview podcast. Every once in a while it will come up, why don't I do a separate program for the interviews? And a lot of times I have a guest host on and we talk about current events or what have you. And why don't we do something else for that? And to divvy up the podcast into all those different categories, there may be a time when I clearly have to do a separate show with a different branding. But for the most part, I don't like the audience having to search out the program. If I'm talking about this, you find me here. If I'm talking about that, you find me there. Everything that I do, including the programs that I do for other people, providing they want me to include it on this program, is in the same place. So real easy to find the Billy D's podcast. You can find us pretty much anywhere podcasts are found, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, on down the line. We're on a number of others. I recently have been approached by people who said, I found you here or I found you there. There's new networks picking us up all the time, which, I'm absolutely thrilled about. But primarily, I would say most of our listens come from Apple Podcasts and Spotify. What we're going to talk about today is the evolution of news and how we consider news. And I believe the history of anything to fully understand it. We hear a lot of people criticizing news people now. There's fake news, there's this and that. And we're going to cover that. We're going to cover a little bit about news and how it's gotten to where it is today and how it got started, especially in broadcast media, okay? And we're going to talk about alternative facts. Yes, there is such a thing. Alternative facts. We're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about known unknowns as it relates to the context and the nuance of news stories. And both of those terms, alternative facts and known unknowns, those are terms that have gotten a lot of criticism. And it depends on your interpretation of those terms, but they are a real thing. And we're going to cover that. There is a legitimate way to consider those terms. Let me put it that way. And we're going to talk about that on today's program. Now, I mentioned the history of news, and some of the things we're going to talk about today I have experienced firsthand, and because I'm of a certain age, we'll put it that way. And also, there's just things that I have learned through research and understanding the history of our country, especially the last century from World War II on. And I believe that's important. It really upsets me when politicos, we'll call them, people who are really speaking the language of politics and they're trying to influence public opinion. It really upsets me when they constantly bring up the Hitler comparisons. And that's fine. If you have a legitimate comparison that you want to bring up, but most of the time it's not the case. We just know that from a historical context, the general knowledge is that Hitler was bad. Okay, so if you have a political foe, you're going to bring up something that compares to Hitler. All right, and that whole subject of how Hitler rose to power and World War II is very complex. And you can draw comparisons based upon your opinion as much as you want. And that's where I really believe that to really understand the rise of Hitler, you have to understand the politics of the time, all the countries involved. And there's a comedian that says new rule. He's got a whole bit about new rules. And my new rule would be, if you're no matter what your political persuasion is, if you are going to draw up Hitler comparisons, you have to be able to name the Axis powers and the Allied powers. And if you don't know what those are, let alone what members belong to which side, I don't want to hear your lectures about Hitler, okay? If you don't know at least that much about World War II, then I got to say the comparisons to Hitler are probably going to fall flat on me. And the other thing is about a knowledge of history. A lot of, I'll say younger, but not all. We have to make sure we don't make broad, sweeping generalizations, right? But a lot of young folks will talk about current events. And when I mention something about Ronald Reagan, let's say, they'll say, well, that was before my time. It doesn't matter because it was before my time. I'm not so sure. I understand it's a backhanded slap at me for being of a certain age. But I'm not so sure that I would be proud of the fact, if I'm getting involved in politics, that I don't know anything about history from, Ronald Reagan. I talk a lot about politics and I talk a lot about history, and Abraham Lincoln was before my time, but I know who he was. Julius Caesar was before my time, but I know who he was. William McKinley was before my time, but I know who he was. I could go on with this. And it's really important to have a working knowledge of not only things that have happened that you've experienced, but what led up to those things before you were here. And that really is an important context that I feel a lot of people don't understand. But quite frankly, you know what? I'll take the extra step in saying that a lot of people don't even know anything about history for the time that they were alive. We're getting to that point now where people don't understand recent events, that they were adults during that time, and they're that detached from world events. And I'm not saying you have to be a news junkie or a history junkie, but that's what worries me about elections now, is people are really voting for a brand. They're voting for a brand that has been packaged and sold to them. And we're going to talk about how the history of news has evolved to that point. Let's start. I mentioned World War II. And I'm going to start there because I really feel that World War II really shaped the world that we have today. Okay? And from that point on to the present day is something that is very important, in my opinion, because a lot of things happened during that time period that are very unique moments in history. And we're going to start with broadcasting because that's important. How we get information and how we process it has really changed since World War II. During World War II, the war started for the United States with the Pearl Harbor attack. And that's when President Roosevelt gave his famous "A day which will live in infamy." We've all heard that quote, right? At least I hope we have. And that speech was heard on the radio. And for a long time, real, quote unquote, real journalism was on the radio. And as the 1950s began to roll around and progress, television emerged as a very important medium. And news during that time period in general was kind of considered a public service. And quite frankly, news organizations during that time did news, I would say almost begrudgingly. Okay, we have to talk about what's going on. That's something we're mandated to do. And it really cuts into the time that we could be selling entertainment programming. We could be selling cereal, okay? And we can't because we have to do this news that nobody really wants to listen to except a few people here and there. And anybody who really wants to know anything about the news is going to be reading the newspaper or listening to the radio. Okay? Well, something changed in 1960 in that President Kennedy came along. And there's a lot of dynamics about that presidency that are twofold, very, I would say, ironic things about that presidency. He was a very dynamic, dashing personality, President Kennedy was, and very friendly to the camera. The camera just loved him. And the Nixon-Kennedy debates were probably the first television debates as we know them today. And his whole presidency, he understood the press. He understood the news conferences and the impact that those would have. And quite frankly, the media loved him. He knew how to ingratiate the media. And here again, I say it's ironic because his emergence onto the scene was pivotal in television news. But his tragic leaving the presidency, his horrible assassination, really also impacted the medium. And this was because, obviously, an assassination of a president drew in people that wanted information. And they not only wanted to hear information, but they wanted to view it. So he was assassinated on a Friday, and that 3-day weekend, Americans were glued to the TV. And one of the stories I liked about Walter Cronkite was when the news came to the news desk that he had actually died. They said, we got to go with this. No. He said, we have to be sure. So they had a system where, they made sure that the sources that were giving this information were correct. And Cronkite's, his dedication as a journalist was something as powerful as that the president is dead. We have to be right more than we have to be first. And here again, like I said about news being a public service, this was something, he was part of an era where being factual and being correct was much more important. I'm not even sure that ratings at that time were a priority for news. It was more of a journalistic obligation. And a lot of that changed because as America was glued to the TV during that weekend, a lot of executives behind the scenes, it started to occur to them, we can sell a lot of cereal with this news stuff. Okay? They had a captivated audience. And during that 3-day weekend, the president's assassin subsequently was assassinated on live TV. This isn't a movie. This isn't a television show. This wasn't stage acting. This was history playing out in people's living rooms. What could be more powerful to sell people soap, to sell people underwear, to sell people deodorant than things that were really impacting their lives? And the 1960s, full of these kind of stories. Vietnam. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. The civil rights movement. All of these things played out in America's living rooms. And an interesting thing about Vietnam as well, in this new, very young at that time, marketplace of news, Vietnam was brought home into people's living rooms. And in World War II, for the most part, we did not have that. Even in print media, the movies during World War II were very patriotic. And I don't believe that they were necessarily propaganda, but they portrayed the beach landings, for example, as "Here comes America," and they had the American flag. And during World War II, there was a picture published of an American soldier who had fallen face down on the beach, and he sank into the sand as the tides and so forth were coming up and the waves were coming up and washing back. He just sank into the sand. And that image of a face down bloody soldier sunken into the sand was published, and it shocked America. America was not really ready for that image because this was a different image than what they were used to. This was where their sons and daughters were going. This is where they were at. They weren't standing at the Eiffel Tower taking pictures. This was real bad stuff. And just that one image shocked America during World War II. And during the Vietnam era, there were films being brought back. Video was playing out. Horrible battle sequences and things. And this changed the perception of how war was processed in the news. And television did a good thing, I would say, by bringing this home, this reality home during Vietnam. But there was a certain amount of sensationalism that went along with this. This was where competing for viewers was starting to really heat up. And then as we went into the 1970s, Watergate. And Watergate, again, captivated America. The hearings were broadcast live on TV. But this is where news and politics started to get a little blurry. That line between what was news and what was political started to get blurry. Now, I was actually pretty young, very young, just starting out in grade school during the Watergate years. But I have a vague recollection of what adults were saying during that time. And as I've researched it, I've noticed this is where a lot of bloviating started from the news anchors. You know, this is, Mr. Nixon and the head their jaw. Mr. Nixon has got to realize that he is not above the law, and blah, 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 blah. And this is where a lot of that bloviating started. This is where opinion news was early, and I don't know that it was intentionally misguided in terms of journalism, but it started. This is where people's opinions about a given president started to creep in to the news, what we call the news. And journalists, as the 70s wore on, started to realize that a lot of their bloviating, a lot of their soapbox standing preaching was getting listened to. They liked that. That was a good thing. And the 1980s now, you have this recipe of news being something that sells products and as a platform for journalists and other people to state their opinion. You have this recipe now for the 1980s. You have a very popular president, okay? People liked news about the president, and cable news started to emerge. Cable news also added another dynamic. Obviously, now there's news stations, not just news programs, but there's stations now that are competing for viewers. And there's a 24-hour news cycle. Only so much happens in a given day. So this is where are the news programs reporting the news, or are they creating it? Okay, this is where they had a lot more room to move in terms of what was newsworthy. A whole different dimension there. And as the 90s started to roll around, this competition for viewers with all of the news channels, 24-hour news channels, it started to get worse because now you were competing for a certain type of viewer. What kind of viewer can we keep captivated? And they started to realize, well, if they stayed on conservatism or if they went a progressive route, a certain audience would follow. So a lot of opinion-generated shows, a lot of commentary programs started appearing on all these 24-hour news networks. Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with an opinion-driven show as long as the person who's presenting these opinions flatly states, this is my opinion. I'm a conservative, and here's my right-wing perspective. Or I'm a liberal, okay? I like things from the progressive standpoint, and this is my progressive opinion. But during the 1990s, a lot of these opinion-driven shows were anchored by people who were formerly giving, quote-unquote, the news. So what was news and what was opinion got kind of blurry, all right? And that decade didn't so much end in the year 2000, but it ended with 9/11. 9/11, how much of this was orchestrated by the attackers, I'm not sure. But when the Twin Towers were hit the first time, there's very few pictures of that initial impact. But there was a delay before the second plane hit. And New York is probably one of the most media-rich environments in the world. And it was just a given that for that second hit, there would be television cameras and all kinds of cameras focused on that World Trade Center. And that, again, live and in real time, that second impact was broadcast live into people's homes. And now things really changed. Okay, there was a new generation of people who may not have experienced the Kennedy assassination, who were glued to their TVs on the phone with their parents. Oh my, can you believe this? And there was a new active, fluid dynamic to news that was going to be born. And this is where the breaking news, in my opinion, this is kind of my opinion from my observation, this is where that was born out of that, because you know how they have the little chime, this is breaking news, okay? When that was going on in the wake of 9/11, every time you heard that on the TV, it was like, oh no, what's happened now? Because we went through this whole thing of the second plane hitting the World Trade Center, and then there was a crash at the Pentagon, and there was the crash in Pennsylvania. So every time, for weeks and months after that, every time you heard that little chime, what's happening now? And this is going to sound very cynical, but I can't believe that during that time period, somebody didn't notice that when we have this breaking news, we get everybody's attention. And that's a sad, cynical point of view. But here again, just like light bulbs went off during the Kennedy assassination, I can't believe that light bulbs didn't go off. So now everything is breaking news. And it's used so much that it's lost its meaning. There is a certain newscast that begins at 6:30 every day, and the anchor says, breaking news, with that protruding jaw, breaking news. No, if the news starts, your news program starts at 6:30, Whatever you're talking about at 6:30 is the news. Okay? Talking about what Congress passed that day or didn't pass that day at 6:30 is the news. To me, breaking news is something that's very fluid. It's happening in real time, and the outcome is unknown. That is breaking news, in my opinion. Talking about some satellite that lost its signal at 6:30 when your news program is on isn't really breaking news. It's something that happened that day. Therefore, it is news. The breaking news term, Flashpoint, that they put on has lost its meaning now. Everything is breaking news. And that's part of news becoming entertainment. It's becoming, hey, over here, watch us. We got the breaking news. We're first with all this. And breaking news shouldn't be first. Breaking news should be something that is actively happening, fluid, impactful, outcome unknown. That's breaking news. It shouldn't be a call point to bring your viewers in so that you can sell them cereal. That is not what it should be. And this is where news organizations have lost a lot of their credibility. Alternative facts. We heard that term and it was mocked. But here's where news now can influence you without necessarily giving an opinion. But there is such a thing as alternative facts. That is something that's real. There's an old saying that figures don't lie, but liars figure. And that is very true. You can choose what facts support your opinion and present them as facts. And the fact that they are factual, if that makes any sense, is all true and it rings as news, but it's not necessarily representative of the entire picture. And this is where I've noticed wide swings in analysis. Let's say the president, and any president, not just the President Trump, but any president, does something. And on the conservative-leaning news channel, they pick the facts that support a positive image of the president, and that's all they talk about. And at the same time, the liberal-leaning news organization, and that's really a bad term. There should not be any ideological description of news. But given the circumstances as they are, the liberal-leaning news organization takes all the negative aspects of that given action to support the fact that they don't like the president. So you can flip between these two news channels, and the contrast will be the greatest president ever just did something wonderful today, and the worst president ever just destroyed our country again. Okay, it's that wide of a swing. And it shouldn't be that way. Is that something that the old guard would have done during the 1950s when news was a public service, when it was a public obligation? Is that something that the Cronkite Era journalists would do? I can't believe that. I can't believe that that's the case. So there is such a thing as alternative facts, and be aware of that. Okay, and that's something, the viewer responsibility is something I'm going to wrap up with here in just a little bit, but that's important. And another thing I talked about, I mentioned at the beginning of the program, a term that we need to reconsider is known unknowns. And it sounds like a real conflict of terms, but it's not. And it's important because it represents a nuance to the story that news today just doesn't cover. Okay. And that is, for example, I'm pretty good generally with computers. And every once in a while, I'll get into a situation where I'm doing something with a computer, and I realize I understand what I don't know about what I'm trying to do. So I have to research it. I have to, contact my other technical people, or I have to research it myself and I have to find a solution. I know what I don't know about that problem. I can figure it out. Whereas with brain surgery, I can't even begin to imagine how to even start doing brain surgery. So I don't know what I don't know. I'm not intelligent enough about the process of brain surgery to know what I don't know. It's just such a void. It's so foreign. I couldn't even, I don't even know how you start to cut the skin or anything. So how would I know what I don't know about brain surgery? Okay, and that's an important thing because it speaks to motive. When we analyze something that, let's say, a president or a politician is doing, the first place that news organizations want to go, news, how is this going to affect your pocketbook? This is the news that you can use, which is a phrase that drives me crazy. And I'm going to tell you why in a minute. But we don't cover what we don't know about that action. We don't examine what the motives might have been that started that process going. And the next step should be we have to find this out tomorrow on our news program to find out what we don't know about this. We have to find this. These are the things. This is the next place we have to go with this story. And you never hear that. Never. I can't say never. I don't know for sure, but I would have to say that in my experience of watching news, I have never heard a journalist say, we have to find out why this happened, and we're going to tell you tomorrow before we can give you the full story. Almost never. And this is where I want to end up with, is I feel that we as viewers of the news have to be more responsible. I'm not sure which created which, but we have a situation now when you factor in social media, when you factor in how news is presented on social media, what gets the clicks as opposed to what doesn't. And this speaks to ratings in broadcast. You know, what brings the viewers in as opposed to what doesn't. How is our behavior in terms of how we consume this information impacting what's given us? And it shouldn't be that way, but it is. You know, I personally like programs that challenge my viewpoints of things. And most people don't. This news you can lose is really code for news that you like. If you're conservative, watch us, because we're going to tell you stuff that makes you feel comfortable. And if you're liberal, we're going to give you the news that you really like. We're going to tell you how bad this president really is. And it feeds these bubbles. One of the things that I said earlier was how you can switch back and forth between two news programs and get the same facts presented in a different way, alternative facts, and a completely different outcome. Unfortunately, now that's how you have to get balanced news. And you have to be more aggressive in how you obtain information and what you read about. You want to make sure you double check the sources that these things are coming from. And really, that shouldn't be happening. That's what journalism is supposed to do for us. But it's gotten to the point now where news is synonymous with entertainment. It's all about selling that cereal, not really informing the public, because informing the public, unfortunately, is boring. And that's on us. That's on us, the viewer. We won't watch nuanced news reports because they're too long. You know, if we watch a video that's more than a minute long about whatever's going on, you know, we lose interest. And we certainly don't want to read anything because that takes too much time, too much effort, too much work. That's on us. Okay, this information is being fed to us based upon our habits because it sells cereal. And that's on us. A large part of that is our responsibility to that. One of the most difficult things you can do as an individual, this speaks to not only how you consume news, but how you live as a person. One of the most difficult and most challenging things that you can do is challenge yourself to actually consider the notion that you could be wrong, or that there's other things to consider about how you feel about a given subject. And that was like with the old days when news was a public service. You had to sit through news that you may or may not didn't like to get to your favorite program that started at 7 or 8. And now the entertainment begins for the evening begins during the news program. Or it's 24 hours a day on your favorite news network because they tell you what you like. And it's just not a matter of challenging what you're told, but it's a matter of challenging your own perspectives. Is this really all there is to know about this subject? How I feel about it? What I know about this subject, is that all I know? Or are there some known unknowns? What don't I understand? What questions should I be asking? Why should I accept the information that's coming to me as just the knowns that I need to know? Okay. And I feel that's very important. And it's missing in our society today. So anyway, what's your opinion? I'd be interested. Now, yeah, I'm real easy to find on Twitter. Twitter is kind of like my social media home. And I'm real easy to find on Twitter at Billy D's. You can tweet me anytime. You just have to be nice. We don't have to agree, as the whole point of this episode today is that, we should have different opinions and we should challenge each other, but we shouldn't fight. We shouldn't stay in our bubbles and defend those perimeters like we're in a battle. This information should be shared and processed together. And sometimes someone with an opposing opinion will move the needle on you. Or maybe you might even move the needle on yourself when you start to research these things a little more. And that's actually very satisfying to me. A lot of times in doing these commentaries and researching things, I've discovered things that move the needle on myself. And I would greatly encourage you to do that. It can be very rewarding. Now, I mentioned all the platforms that the Billy D's podcast is on. New to YouTube. I haven't done much with YouTube, so I don't know how many views my YouTube channel gets, but it is something that has become valuable because YouTube is the second biggest search engine there is. And a lot of times people wanting to find out analysis about news, they do a search on YouTube, right? So I'm putting that information on YouTube now. And if you would just like some supporting videos to the podcast, to give you a greater perspective on this program, by all means, check out the Billy D's podcast on YouTube. Also, I really haven't done much with cultivating Facebook, but that's starting to change. We now have a Billy D's Facebook page. And here again, especially on Facebook, you can leave a comment, and Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter. So by all means, send me a tweet. And whether you agree or disagree is immaterial. Just be nice. We have to be nice to one another. Well, I'm Billy D's. Thank you very much for checking out this week's episode. And I will return next week. And I used to sign off this way a lot, but maybe today I'll bring it back. Remember, the easiest person to fool is always yourself. Well, hello everyone. I am Billy D's from the self-titled Billy D's podcast. You can find me on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and many more of the best podcast networks. Join me for my commentary and interviews. Follow me on Twitter, real easy to find, at Billy D's. I am Billy D's. I'd love to have you listen in.